Hello everyone, my name's Andy Curry. I'm the User Experience Director of LION+MASON, and when Andrew asked me to talk, part of what I didn't want to do was come up here and just do some sort of giant advert for LION+MASON, because it's 11 o'clock in the morning and nobody really wants that. Happy to talk about any of our projects with anybody afterwards if they want to. I'll be around all day. But what I thought to myself was, well, what can I do that's an interesting talk, what's going to be interesting, thought-provoking or anything like that, not to set too much of a challenge for myself. What should I call my talk? What I did was I actually looked back. I've talked to conferences over about 20 years of working in digital. I've talked to various conferences across the country. And sometimes when you visit those conferences, if anyone's talked to conferences, sometimes when you go to these conferences, the organisers will often suggest titles for talks to you. And these organisers might not necessarily be from the field or the discipline that you're in, but they might think up, well, what would be a good talk that's related? And it's perfectly understandable, because they're trying to get a cohesive thread throughout their whole conference, throughout their whole event. Now, I should also point out that they aren't actually saying you have to do this title. They're often saying, oh, actually, you know what, it's an idea. They're just being helpful, so I'm certainly not kind of knocking anybody for providing a title. But I have realised that some of the titles, as I looked back, that I've been offered, or asked if given as suggestions. Some of those titles actually kind of revealed to me some of the misconceptions or the preconceptions that people might have about the industry that I work in, user experience and service design and those types of areas. And actually I thought it might be interesting to kind of take some of those titles and kind of pull them apart a bit and see what they tell us about those misconceptions or preconceptions. It's also because I am a monstrous pedant. And part of what I do in my job is I like pulling things apart. I like pulling things into tiny little bits and really seeing how they work and smashing them back together. That the pedantry. So the first title, it's all about the customer. Now that was the first title. That's the first title that came to mind. And actually, you'd think actually myself as a user experience professional, I might actually be completely on board with that. You know, what's to disagree with that? Well, actually, is it all about the customer? And again, like I said, I like pulling things into tiny bits. So, looking at the word customer, that was the thing that actually made me feel a little bit funny about that title that they'd suggested to me. Customer. Now, when we think of a customer, we think of the person who's on the receiving end of a transaction, the receiving end of a certain service. So when I go into a shop and try and buy a pair of shoes, I am the customer. When I download or subscribe to a service like Office 365, I am the customer. When I go into a car forecourt and I try and buy a car, I am the customer. Fair enough. And yes, of course, obviously, the customer is important. Okay? The customer is hugely important in that process. We have to understand the experience of that customer. We have to design a service that actually meets the needs of that customer. However, and people might think this is getting a bit semantic, but I think it's kind of important. Customer is not the only person we have to think about. That end user is not the only person in that entire journey. So if you, for example, take a car purchase journey, there are so many other users throughout that process, okay? So many other different people who are involved in that service. There are people who are working in the sales floor. There are people who are working in the administration side of that. There are people who are managing the actual website through which people see it. There are people who are creating content for that website. There are people who have to work in the customer services. When you're talking about car dealerships, you're also talking about mechanics processing and things like that. The actual communication between the dealership and the factory in terms of the ordering. There are so many different itinerant elements of that process that to say it's all about the customer is false. Because actually, how can the customer have a fantastic experience when other people down that route aren't? Now, how many people have ever seen or even worked in an organisation where all the focus is on the end product, and actually when it comes to a lot of energy and research and kind of design and focus and attention is going into that final public-facing part of the product? But when it comes down to the actual stuff that the internal teams, the staff who work for that organisation have to deal with, they go, it's the admin team, we'll just slap a form on a page, it'll be fine. And they just dump that on people. Now, we've seen that so many times. Now, it is still happening. It's starting to change. We're noticing a trend in the change. People are starting to realise, actually, you know what? If our own teams can't use the internal systems properly that they're given to service customers, how can possibly the customer have a good experience? And it's not just as cynical as making things more efficient or more effective so it pleases the customer. It's actually also about pleasing your own employees as well, the people who have to work. Because they have to work in your company, you know. It's your churn of staff might well happen because the tools that they are given to do their jobs just aren't effective. We heard about incidents where there was a major dealership, I won't name them, but a major car dealership redesigned the platform that their sales teams worked. And they did it without consulting the actual sales team. They just said, we know what's best for them. We're going to redesign this. We're going to make it super amazing. It's going to be a flagship thing. We'll roll it out automatically across all of our dealerships. And it did not do anything that these sales people needed. It made their jobs harder. It made their jobs nightmarish to do. And people were literally leaving the dealerships, walking over the road and going to other dealerships saying, can I have a job? Because I can't make money in the same way as I was doing before. They had to roll the whole thing back at a huge expense to themselves. This kind of lack of attention for the internal users, for the other users throughout the process is why I say, you know, is it all about the customer? Well, no, it's all about the user. Let's talk about, you know, and again, it's in user experience, but it's all about the user, the external user and the internal user, okay? But that's a bit clumsy to say. So, let's go. It's all about the users. Okay, so, we've got the title, It's All About the Users. And what we're really talking about is how do we make it all about the users? It's about understanding who those users are. This is the critical part to any kind of focus on making something all about users. Understanding who they are, and how do we go about doing that, and why is it important? Okay? It's hugely important to understand who your users are, who their circumstances are, what their environment is, what their actual behaviours are, what tools they're using, the actual place. You do this through research, you do this through observation, you do this through monitoring of what they're actually kind of doing and trying to understand them as richly as possible. Because, I mean, how many people haven't been this person at some point? Anybody? I'm going to say, put your hand up if you haven't actually felt like this using an online service at any point. That's not a surprise to me in any way. Now, it might not also be the case that every single problem that you face when you're using a particular tool or service is put your fist through a monitor type situation. It might not be quite that extreme, but even those tiny little issues, those tiny little quibbles and problems that people have, such as every time that you open, you know, Word, they've moved the table of contents button, or the table of contents function, which seems to happen to me every single time I open it. I don't know how they do it. But every single time you have one small problem with the service, every time you have a chip, it chips and chips and chips away at that particular user's sense of trust, their sense of tolerance towards your product. And no product is too big to not have people leave it. You sometimes come across organisations who seem to act as if they are just, oh, well, you know, they've got to use us, so we're the only choice, or we're just so incumbent in this industry that literally no one's going to go anywhere else. But eventually, if you chip away, and Microsoft Word becomes so painful, well, you go to Google Docs. And I think that's the thing. Nobody, no matter how dominant you are in a field, nobody is immune to having people go and find an alternative, because they will find an alternative. And actually, that alternative can sometimes be really simple. This is a quote. I mean, like I say, it was that particular Twitter handle that I saw quote this. This quote might be from someone completely else, but it's a really interesting one. It says, all enterprise software competes with Excel. And all productivity software competes with emailing things to yourself, which is absolutely true. Again, you know, you're trying to kind of, in many cases, there's a good principle behind this. It's a phrase someone used to say to me. It says, the quickest way home is the way that you know. And your product might be the most efficient, it might be the most objectively best way of doing a certain activity or a certain action or achieving a certain result. But if you've got people who are used to doing something in a way that might, you know, when laid side by side, be less efficient, but they know and they feel comfortable with that, and they are happy and they know they can at least achieve the result, then you have a struggle to try and convert someone over to that point. But again, how do you do that? You do that by understanding those users, their problems, their pain points. You do it by understanding and then making sure that your product actually genuinely meets a need and isn't just attempting to kind of just replace one thing that they're already comfortable with. Okay. So, title for my talk, it's all about the users. Right, we've got there. Or is it? Now, is it all about the users? Maybe not. And that might sound surprising to say, but actually I'll come back to that point, because I've got another title that was put together. UX, this was given to me by a digital transformation conference in Manchester that I spoke to, and they said, could you do a title? This is the title you could do. UX, the new business superhero, which sounds really cool. And I thought, well, yeah, let's think about that. Now, I'll point out again, you know, I could have rejected these talk titles. I could have said no. I could have, but I'm a monstrous pedant. And so I thought, you know what, I'll have a go at that. But still, there was a few things that were clicking in my mind when I read that title. And I thought to myself, right, okay, what's the first thing that's just not sitting right with me about that? And it's the word new, okay? The new business superhero. Now, it's fair to say that user experience as a discipline has definitely come of age in the last 10 years, or 15 years. It's actually become something that's, you know, there are departments, there are job titles, disciplines, and things like that. But is it new? And I kind of do take a little exception to this idea that whilst the titles and the semantics and things might be new, and there might be more inline methodologies accepted, you know, there's training courses, there's things like qualifications, it's a very much more established industry. But is it new? Is the principles of what we do new? Well, that's Don Norman, psychologist and designer. And in the early 90s, he was allegedly the first person to have the word user experience in his job title. He's also allegedly the person who coined the phrase user experience. This is the early 90s in Apple. And Don Norman was one of these, he's the great granddaddy of user experience and this twinning of psychology and design. He's great granddaddy of product design theory and everything. You know, he's fantastic. I read some of the books about him that he's written. He's great. But he was doing that in the early 90s. And I did the maths last night, and I realised that's about 25 years ago. Is that right? Yeah? I'm not wrong, am I? Because that feels awful. I was in high school in the early 90s, and that's made me feel really sad inside. But still, that's not new, really. So you could say, actually, this isn't a new discipline. As an aside, by the way, Don Norman is the man that gave his name to what's called the Norman door. Has anyone heard of a Norman door? Yeah, there's a few people nodding, but it's a good one, so I'll just quickly diverge and say this. If you've ever come across a door, and it's got, so on the door, you have a handle on one side, like that, and then on the other side, you have an identical handle. And you go up to the door, and you think, well, it's a handle, so I'll pull it, and it goes, kunk. And you feel like an idiot, because suddenly you failed at opening a door, and then you realise it's a push. And then the people who have installed that door think about it for a while and go, oh, lots of people are pulling on it. We should put a sign on the door that says push, because it's a push door. And they think, okay, that's a solution for that, isn't it? And so people now know to push the door rather than pull it. But when you step back and think about that, you've just had to put an instruction label on a door. That's not a good design. And this was brought out by, you know, this has been spoken about by Don Norman in many of his books. And again, now it's actually turned into an architectural parlance. It's called a Norman door. A door that can potentially confuse someone into something so simple as opening a door, that you have to put a label on it to say how to open a door. That's not a great approach. But anyway, sorry, I find that interesting. But actually, we talk about user experience big. Okay, that's when Don Norman had the title in his job title. He coined the phrase. But actually, that's Walt Disney. Walt Disney, in the 40s and 50s, when they were building the Walt Disney theme parks, instructed his Imagineers in various different activities and behaviours that were designed exclusively to encourage them to know your audience, wear your guests' shoes. He devised frameworks and worked with his Imagineers to get them to understand the visitors to their park, the mentality that would have various different points, and develop this way of thinking and designing every element of the park so that it was done with consideration of the user. Sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? Yes, right. Going a little bit further than that, 1920s, 30s, I think. I forget the exact date. Yeah. He's basically the inventor of the upright Hoover. If people are made safer, more comfortable, more eager to purchase, more efficient, or just plain happier by contact with the product, then the designer has succeeded. Now that's over 100. That's about 100 years ago that people are starting to talk like that and thinking like that in terms of design. But wait, let's go back to 2000 BC, ancient Greece, where they actually observed farmers in the fields and looked into the ergonomics of how they used tools so they could redesign them to make them more efficient and better for the workers and more productive. Sound familiar? You could go back even further if you wanted to, the origins of feng shui back in 3500 BC, and that's all about essentially creating a harmonized environment that is more efficient, that makes people feel happier, more comfortable. So the idea that UX in principle and in ethos is new. Again, I'm being massively pedantic here. But still, the point stands. And I think the reason is that the reason for me to kind of think of this is that I often think that this idea of observing people, of understanding users, of making those understandings and those empathy that you can build up with users through research, through observation, things like that, that's just so blindingly obvious an idea. But the idea that it's some sort of new superhero or new kind of toolkit that we've got, actually it's been around for ages, and it's maybe that we have just rediscovered it. So UX, the rediscovered business superhero. There's a title for it, okay? Now, still some things about that don't work. So UX, the rediscovered business superhero. Okay, so it's the superhero word I want to just pick up on now. Superhero. Right, now that's kind of cool, you know. Who wouldn't like that, you know? I like to think that my wife looks on me in the same way she looks upon Iron Man, you know? It's not true. She doesn't. But still. I like to think it sometimes. But wouldn't it be great? I mean, it's a nice idea to think that that's who we are. You know, we walk onto a new project, we walk into a new business, and we kind of say, yeah, it's all right, calm down, everybody, we're here. You know, I got this. But it isn't true. Because user experience, or indeed any discipline, isn't a silver bullet. It's not something that a company can just buy in and sit there and say, right, brilliant, we're doing it now, fantastic, excellent. Because one superhero on his own is good and is useful and is, can do a lot of things. But Iron Man is never nearly as good than when he's with the Avengers. When he's with his full team and he's got all his buddies around him, that's when he can save the world. That's when he's enabled to actually be able to make miraculous things happen, as they all can. See? Now, if anybody's not quite getting the heavy-handed metaphor that I'm laying out fairly plainly here, I've added some labels just so we can and this is a point actually where someone has in the past, when I've shown a slide like this, gone, I actually work in development, and I'm not very happy about that, because I think you'll find that we're more of a Hulk. And then the content guys get really angry because they've been given Hawkeye. So I'd like to point out, I just threw these titles on there. There was no kind of decision-making process in this done. There's no kind of waiting there. This is a whole argument that if you want to have later, then we'll all discuss Marvel characters in great detail. But still, the point being that Iron Man is great when he's with the Hulk and Hawkeye and Captain America and Black Widow and Thor, because when UX is working inside a company, it can't exist inside a silo. It can't just be some team that you install and then say, off you pop, and then they come back saying, ta-da, here's your amazing thing. We spoke to users, we designed a system that works amazingly, and here you go. Because if UX hasn't had feed-in from development, if UX hasn't had feed-in from content, business ops, marketing, sales, if we don't have the commercial teams involved in UX, if we don't have development teams involved in UX, then the chances of us going away and designing something that might be great for users and then coming back, but only at that point do we suddenly realize, oh, actually, this is going to take us 5 years to build it. Or it's probably going to bankrupt the company because commercially it's just simply not viable. All of those considerations need to be brought into user experience. And user experience also, the findings of user experience need to be spread outwards across the whole organization. So that sense of empathy and that understanding of users is known by development. So a user experience voice in a development sprint is vital, because otherwise you might find yourselves de-scoping functionality that actually, if nobody understands the user in that development team, in that sprint team, then how on earth can they say, well, we know we probably shouldn't de-scope that, or if we de-scope that, we know the consequences to the user of doing that. So they need to work with each other. It's not just about UX pushing out into the rest of the organization and sharing its findings and making sure everybody becomes kind of a UX thinker themselves. It's also about all of those people. They need to feed into what the user experience teams are doing as well. Otherwise, we can't do our jobs without knowing all of these things. We need to know if there's going to be a major technical challenge behind achieving a certain goal. So we can then work together to say, okay, what's another route to the same goal to achieve the same kind of positive benefit for the user? So it feeds into absolutely everything. And this is why when I said that title, it's all about the users, I still didn't feel completely comfortable with, because it's not all about the users. It's users, wildly important, hugely important, but it can't always be the users in a practical sense. It has to be about the users, but also about the needs of a business as well, and the needs of a team, and the needs of the other dozens of different teams that need to work together to make something truly great go back out there into the world. So, to wrap up, this is the new title of my talk. It is UX, the rediscovered part of your business superhero team. Which is a rubbish title for a talk, so I'm going to go and have a think about what I'll do for the next one, and I will leave you with people to actually talk about much more interesting things. I've been Andy Curry, thank you very much.